Social workers, what case kept you awake for months? I was 15 minutes late to work that morning because I got stuck in my own front door trying to leave. I rushed into the office expecting another routine day of paperwork and home visits. My supervisor, Delilah, was waiting by my desk, with that expression she got when she had to hand out the cases nobody wanted to take. She dropped a thick folder in front of me and said the words that would haunt me for the next year. Family of 6 living in their car behind the Walmart on Route 9. Father works 3 jobs, but CPS wants the children removed immediately. I flipped open the file and saw photos that made my stomach drop. 6 kids ranging from age 2 to 14, all crammed into a beat-up minivan with garbage bags of clothes and a cooler that served as their refrigerator. The intake report said they'd been living like this for 8 months after losing their apartment when the father, David Calloway, got injured at his construction job and missed 2 months of work. Despite working as a night security guard, weekend landscaper, and early morning dishwasher, he couldn't catch up on the back rent. The family had been evicted in January, and it was now September. What made my hands shake was the red stamp across the top of the file. Immediate removal recommended, neglect and endangerment. The caseworker who'd done the initial assessment had written in bold letters that no children should be living in a vehicle regardless of circumstances, and that Mr. Calloway's work schedule left the kids unsupervised for dangerous periods. I drove to the Walmart parking lot, expecting to find what every social worker dreads: dirty children, parents who'd given up, a situation that clearly justified breaking up the family. Instead, I found something that would shake everything I thought I knew about the system. The minivan was clean inside, organized with military precision. Sleeping bags were rolled and stacked. Clothes were folded in neat piles. The kids were doing homework at a picnic table David had somehow convinced Walmart to let him set up nearby. The oldest girl, Autumn, was helping the little ones with math while simultaneously keeping an eye on the toddler. When David saw me approaching, his face went pale, but he walked over with his shoulders straight and his head up. He was thin, exhausted, wearing a uniform shirt from his security job, but he looked me in the eye when he spoke. "Sir, I know why you're here. I know how this looks, but my kids are fed, they're clean, they're in school every day, and they're loved. I'm not giving up on them." His voice cracked on the last word, but he didn't look away. I asked to speak with each child individually, standard protocol, expecting to find kids who were traumatized or angry about their situation. Instead, I found a family that had turned surviving into an art form. Each child had specific responsibilities. The older ones helped with the younger ones. They had a system for everything, from bath time using the McDonald's bathroom to doing laundry at the laundromat twice a week. What struck me most was how they talked about their dad, not with the resigned acceptance I usually heard from kids in bad situations, but with genuine respect and love. 10-year-old Jamal told me his dad was the hardest working person he knew and that they were going to get an apartment soon because dad was saving money from all 3 jobs. 8-year-old Destiny said their dad read them stories every night before bed and helped them with homework even when he was tired from work. When I asked if they felt safe, all of them said yes immediately, without hesitation. They felt safer with their dad in the car than they had in some of the places they'd stayed before. But then, 12-year-old Maya pulled me aside and whispered something that changed everything. She said there was a man who'd been watching them at night, sitting in a red pickup truck across the parking lot. He'd been there for a week, always after dark, just watching their van. Her dad didn't know because he was at his security job, but Maya stayed awake to keep watch while the others slept. She described the man as middle-aged with a beard and said he sometimes got out of his truck and walked closer to look at their setup. My blood went cold as I realized this family wasn't just vulnerable because of their housing situation. They were exposed to predators who saw homeless children as easy targets. I spent 3 hours with the family, and everything I saw contradicted what the paperwork said. Yes, they were living in a car, which was technically inadequate housing. Yes, David was gone working a lot, but Autumn was mature and responsible, and the kids were never actually alone because they stayed near businesses where people knew them. The Walmart employees had been looking out for them. The McDonald's manager let them use the bathroom and sometimes gave them free food. The laundromat owner let them charge their phones and do homework at his tables. This wasn't a family that had been abandoned by the system. This was a family the system was trying to abandon, while real danger circled them like vultures. That evening, I sat in my apartment writing my assessment report, but I couldn't focus on policy violations when Maya's words kept echoing in my head. A predator was stalking this family, and if I recommended removal, The children would be scattered across different foster homes while their stalker remained free to find other victims. But if I recommended they stay together, they'd remain vulnerable in that parking lot until David could find housing. I called the police to report the suspicious activity, but they said they couldn't do anything unless the man actually committed a crime. Watching people in a public parking lot wasn't illegal, even if it was creepy. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Delilah and presented everything I'd observed. I showed her photos of the organized car, the kids' clean clothes, their homework scores, their clear affection for their father. I also told her about the predator Maya had described, and how removing the children might actually put them in more danger by separating them from the only adult who'd been protecting them. Delilah listened patiently, then opened her desk drawer and pulled out a newspaper clipping from 6 months earlier. A family of 4 had been living in their car in a neighboring county when the father had a heart attack at 2 a.m. The mother couldn't get the car started to drive him to the hospital, and by the time emergency services arrived, he was dead. The 2 children had been traumatized, watching their father die while trapped in a vehicle. "That's why we have the policy," Delilah explained. "It only takes one emergency, one accident, one night when everything goes wrong." I understood the logic, but I also saw the faces of David's children when they talked about their father. Removing them wouldn't just separate a family, it would destroy 6 people who had learned to be strong together, while potentially delivering them into the hands of someone who meant them harm. I asked for 30 days to help David find housing and to work with police to identify the man who'd been watching them. Delilah shook her head and said the wheels were already in motion. A court hearing was scheduled for the following week, and unless David could produce proof of adequate housing by then, the children would be placed in foster care. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 5 years of social work. I drove back to the Walmart parking lot and told David about the court hearing, but I also told him about what Maya had shared with me. His face went white, then red with rage. He'd had no idea someone was watching his children while he was at work. He immediately called his night security supervisor and arranged to switch to day shifts, even though it meant a significant pay cut. When I asked why he was willing to sacrifice income they desperately needed, he said no amount of money was worth risking his children's safety, but the shift change created a new problem. David's day security job only paid half what he'd been making on nights, and combined with his weekend landscaping and dishwasher work, he was now $400 short each month of what he needed for an apartment. Even if he found a place willing to rent to someone living in a car, he couldn't afford it. As I drove away that evening, I saw David setting up a new sleeping arrangement where he could see the entire parking lot from the driver's seat. He wasn't going to sleep until he knew who was watching his family and why. 2 days later, David called me at 6 a.m. His voice was shaking with exhaustion and fear. The man in the red pickup had approached their van at 3 a.m. while the children were sleeping. David had pretended to be asleep while listening to the man walk around their vehicle, testing door handles and looking through windows. When the stranger tried to open the sliding door where the kids were sleeping, David had jumped out and confronted him. The man claimed he was just checking on them, that he'd heard children crying and wanted to make sure they were okay. But when David asked why he'd been watching them for 2 weeks, the man got aggressive and said David was an unfit father who deserved to have his kids taken away. The confrontation ended when a Walmart security guard heard the shouting and came to investigate. The man in the pickup drove away before police arrived, but not before David got a photo of his license plate. When officers ran the plates, they discovered the man was named Gerald Ashford, and he had a record of approaching homeless families with offers of help that turned into something much darker. He'd been investigated twice for suspicious contact with children, but charges were never filed due to lack of evidence. The police told David they'd increase patrols in the area, but warned that Ashford hadn't technically committed a crime yet. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about the Calloway family. I drove past the Walmart lot and saw David had moved their setup closer to the store entrance, where the security cameras could see them clearly. The children were doing homework as usual, but I noticed they kept looking around nervously, and Autumn stayed closer to her younger siblings than before. The stress was affecting all of them, even though David was trying to act like everything was normal. On Sunday, my phone rang at 7 a.m. David's voice was shaking with exhaustion, but there was something else there too: desperation. He said he'd found a 2-bedroom apartment through a church connection, but the landlord wanted first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. Total cost was $2,400, and he had exactly $800 saved. He'd already applied for emergency housing assistance, but the waiting list was 3 months long. The charity organizations he'd called were tapped out of funds. He had 4 days to come up with $1,600 or lose his children, and now with Gerald Ashford stalking them, staying in the parking lot was becoming more dangerous every night. The police had arrested Ashford the night before for public intoxication, but he'd be released within hours. I hung up the phone and stared at my bank account balance. I had $2,100 in savings, money I'd been putting away for a vacation I never seemed to take. Every professional instinct I had told me not to get personally involved, not to cross the line between caseworker and client. But I also knew that David Calloway was a better father than half the men whose children I'd left in their homes because they met the technical requirements for adequate housing. More importantly, I knew that if these kids went into foster care while Ashford was still free, there was no guarantee the system could protect them from a predator who'd already shown dangerous interest in their family. Monday morning, I walked into David's hearing with my official recommendation that the children remain with their father pending his securing adequate housing within 1 week. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Vale, reviewed my report and asked pointed questions about the family's living situation. When I described the organization inside the van, the children's academic performance, their emotional stability, and their clear bond with their father, I saw her expression soften slightly. But when I mentioned Gerald Ashford and the ongoing police investigation, her face hardened with concern. She asked why I was recommending the children remain in a situation where a known predator had access to them. I explained that separating the family would scatter the children across different foster homes throughout the county, making it impossible to provide coordinated protection. David had proven he could keep his children safe when he was with them. The problem was his work schedule, which he'd already adjusted to prioritize their safety over income. Judge Vale asked if I had any concrete plan for addressing the housing crisis that had created this entire situation. That's when I made the decision that would either save this family or end my career. I told the court that David had identified suitable housing and that I believed the financial obstacles could be overcome with community support. When the county attorney asked for specifics, I said arrangements were being made through local charities and faith communities. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. I was banking everything on my ability to make those arrangements happen in the next few hours. Judge Vale looked skeptical, but agreed to recess the hearing until 2 p.m. to give me time to present concrete evidence of housing arrangements. During the recess, I found David in the hallway with his head in his hands, Autumn rubbing his shoulder while the other children sat quietly in chairs that were too big for them. That's when I made the decision that would either save this family or destroy my career. I walked over to David and handed him an envelope with $1,600 in cash and the address of the apartment he'd found. His eyes widened, and he started to protest, but I cut him off. I told him to go sign the lease right now, bring back the signed agreement, and save his family. He stared at the money like it might disappear, then looked at his children and back at me. "I'll pay you back every penny," he whispered. "I don't care about the money," I said. "I care about them." David ran out of the courthouse while I sat with his children, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I'd just violated every professional boundary I'd been taught, potentially compromised a legal proceeding, and possibly handed $1,600 to someone I'd known for less than a week. Autumn looked at me with those old, wise eyes that children develop when they've been forced to grow up too fast. "Mr. Kendrick," she said quietly, "are you going to get in trouble for helping us?" I didn't know how to answer that question honestly, so I just told her that sometimes adults have to make hard choices to protect children, and that's what her father had been doing all along. But 40 minutes passed, then an hour, and David still hadn't returned. I started to panic, wondering if I'd just been conned by someone who'd disappeared with my savings. Maya noticed my growing anxiety and whispered that her dad would never abandon them, that he must be having trouble with the paperwork or the landlord. Just as court was about to reconvene, David burst through the courthouse doors with a signed lease agreement and tears streaming down his face. When court resumed, he handed the paperwork to Judge Vale, who examined it carefully and confirmed that the family now had adequate housing as of today. Judge Vale looked at me with a question in her eyes about how this had happened so quickly, but legally, it didn't matter. The children could remain with their father as long as he maintained suitable housing. However, she wasn't finished with the case. She ordered that David and his family be relocated to their new apartment immediately, with police escort to ensure Gerald Ashford couldn't follow them. She also mandated weekly check-ins for 6 months to ensure the family's stability, with the case to be closed if no issues arose. As we walked out of the courthouse, David's kids surrounded him in a group hug, that made every person in the hallway stop and stare. That evening, I helped David move his family from the Walmart parking lot to their new apartment. As we loaded their belongings from the minivan, I noticed Gerald Ashford's red pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot, engine running. David saw him too, and his jaw tightened, but he focused on getting his children safely into the building. The police escort waited until we'd moved everything inside and then followed us to make sure Ashford didn't trail us to the new address. As I watched the children explore their new home, touching walls and flipping light switches like they were magic, I felt a mixture of relief and terror about what I'd done. 3 days later, Delilah called me into her office with a concerned expression. Someone had reported seeing me give money to a client, and there were questions about my professional conduct. My stomach dropped as she explained that the county was launching an investigation into potential ethics violations. I could be suspended pending the outcome, and if the allegations were proven, I could lose my license permanently. I asked who had reported me, and she said it was someone who'd been at the courthouse during the hearing. As I walked back to my desk, I wondered if saving one family had been worth potentially ending my ability to help any others, but then the case took a turn that nobody expected. Gerald Ashford had been arrested again, this time for breaking into a homeless shelter and attempting to assault a family with young children. During his interrogation, police discovered he'd been stalking multiple homeless families across 3 counties, targeting single fathers with children who had no permanent address. He'd used their vulnerability and desperation to gain their trust, offering help with food and money before attempting to abuse their children. The Calloway family had been his intended next victims, and my intervention had likely prevented a horrific crime. The investigation took 3 weeks, during which I was placed on administrative leave and had to meet with lawyers and department heads to explain my actions. I told them everything honestly. I explained why I believed David Calloway was a good father in an impossible situation, why the system was failing his family, and why I'd chosen to help when no one else would. I also presented the police reports about Gerald Ashford's arrest and the detective's statement that my actions had likely prevented child abuse. Some officials looked at me like I was naive or unprofessional. Others seemed to understand but were bound by regulations that didn't allow for exceptions, even compassionate ones. During my suspension, something unexpected happened. David had started paying me back $10 at a time, money he clearly couldn't spare but insisted on sending with handwritten notes thanking me for believing in his family. But the 5th envelope contained more than just money. It included a newspaper clipping about Gerald Ashford's conviction on multiple charges of child endangerment and attempted assault. The article mentioned that his arrest had prevented him from targeting other homeless families and quoted a detective saying that social services cooperation had been crucial in protecting potential victims. Autumn had written me a letter describing their new apartment, how it felt to have their own beds again, how her little siblings were sleeping better now that they felt secure. But she also wrote about something else. She said her dad cried every night for a week, not from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. She said they'd started a family tradition of saying a prayer for me before dinner every night, thanking God for sending someone who cared more about their family than about following rules. Reading her letter, I knew I'd made the right choice, even if it cost me everything. The hearing to determine my fate was scheduled for a month later, and I spent the weeks leading up to it preparing my defense and updating my resume in case I needed to find a new career. My lawyer said the county was divided. Some officials wanted me terminated as an example to other workers who might consider bending the rules. Others felt that my actions, while inappropriate, had resulted in a positive outcome for a family that deserved help and had potentially prevented serious crimes against children. The case had attracted attention from local advocacy groups who supported family preservation over system adherence, and they were putting pressure on the county to show leniency. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the conference room expecting to face a panel of administrators ready to end my career. Instead, I found David Calloway sitting at the witness table, wearing the same shirt and tie he'd worn to court, with a folder thick with documents in front of him. He'd asked to speak on my behalf, and had brought employment records showing he'd picked up a 4th part-time job to pay back the money faster. He'd also brought report cards showing all 6 of his children had improved their grades since moving into stable housing, and letters from teachers praising the family's resilience and Autumn's leadership with her siblings. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Detective Raymond Morris, who'd led the investigation into Gerald Ashford, had asked to address the panel. He explained that Ashford had been targeting homeless families, specifically because they were vulnerable and isolated from support systems. When children lived in cars or temporary shelters, They were easy prey for predators who knew their families were desperate and wouldn't be believed if they reported abuse. By keeping the Calloway family together and helping them secure stable housing, I had disrupted Ashford's pattern and likely saved other children from becoming victims. When David stood to speak, his voice was steady and clear. He said that I had shown his family more compassion and understanding in 1 week than the system had shown them in 8 months of crisis. He said I hadn't just given them money, I'd given them hope, dignity, and the chance to stay together when everything was designed to tear them apart. He said I'd seen his children as individual human beings with value and potential, not as statistics or policy violations. Most importantly, he said I'd recognized that sometimes protecting children means breaking rules that put them in more danger than the problems those rules were designed to solve. The panel deliberated for 2 hours while I sat in the hallway with David and his children, who had missed school to come support me at the hearing. When they called us back in, the department head stood and read their decision. I would receive a formal reprimand for violating professional boundaries and would be required to attend additional training on ethics and protocol compliance. However, given the positive outcome for the family and the role my actions played in preventing crimes against children, I would not lose my job or my license. They noted that while my methods were inappropriate, my judgment in recognizing a stable family in crisis had been sound, and they were implementing policy changes to provide more flexibility in similar situations. But the story didn't end there. 6 months later, I received a call from the FBI. Gerald Ashford's case had led to a broader investigation into a network of predators who specifically targeted homeless families. My case file on the Calloway family had become crucial evidence in understanding how these predators operated and identifying other potential victims. The agent asked if I would be willing to testify about what I'd observed and how the current system's policies sometimes made vulnerable families even more accessible to predators. A year later, I was invited to speak at a national conference on child welfare policy. I shared the Calloway family's story and the lessons it had taught me about the difference between following rules and protecting children. David and his children were in the audience, all of them healthy and thriving. David had been promoted to full-time at his security job and had given up his other positions. All 6 children were excelling in school and had formed friendships in their neighborhood. They'd been removed from the at-risk registry and closed as a successful case. After my presentation, a young social worker approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she was facing a similar situation with a family living in their car, and her supervisor was pressuring her to recommend removal. She asked what advice I would give her. I told her the same thing I'd learned from the Calloway family, that the most important part of social work isn't following rules, it's recognizing when the rules are failing the people they're supposed to protect, and having the courage to choose compassion over compliance when a family's future hangs in the balance. Sometimes the system needs someone willing to remember that policies exist to protect people, not the other way around.